You skewer the last of the little ankle biters, and the goblin collapses dead on the ground.
Okay, finally. I loot them.
Add 6 scimitars, shields, short bows, and leather armors.
Let's move on. I open the next door.
You open the door into another 30 by 30 foot chamber, and the goblin spots you. Roll initiative.
That's it.
There's a bugbear this time. Does that sound familiar? I've run that dungeon. I bet you have too. Each room is an isolated encounter that has little to do with anything outside of it. You go around opening doors and rolling initiative until your players suddenly develop scheduling issues and your campaign dies. That's brutal. You'd be better off running an actual dungeon.
What? This is a dungeon crawl and it sucks.
That's not a dungeon. It's just a railroad that's been painted to look like a dungeon. It's dank underground with rooms, doors, but it's entirely linear and incredibly boring. Real dungeons are about exploration, combat, passage of time, plot, adventure, discovery. Dungeons are a microcosm of D&D, and they allow your players to constantly make impactful choices. Dungeons are the heart of the game.
You forgot about the essence of the game. It's about the cones.
Welcome to Mystic Arts, where I desperately try to synthesize the dungeon blogosphere into a single video. My name is Daði, I'm a professional writer and director, and I've been DMing for over 10 years. Today I'm going to tell you about 6 fundamental pillars that together hold up the massive vaulted ceiling of our dungeon. Once you add these into your dungeon, you will create a compelling dungeon crawl. Basically, you open the doors into a massive temple chamber. The vaulted ceiling is some 50 feet high, with murals and drawings that dance along the ceiling. Cracked stone stairs lead down 15 feet onto the dungeon floor itself. You feel your ears pop as you descend further into the underground complex. At the far end of the chamber, 60 feet ahead of you, there's an altar. Between here and there are 5-foot diameter columns, each 10 feet apart. On each of the columns, etched with shoddy craftsmanship, is a single word, different for each column. 6 words in total, and on the altar at the end, another word. What do?
Can I read the text on the columns?
Sure. You walk up and read it, and it says, Arena. Once you're in a dungeon, you're in the arena. It's the play space where the stakes of the adventure come to the forefront, and every action and choice you make threatens to echo through the rest of the campaign. When your players enter the arena, there will be a certain sort of relief that comes with it. Or maybe it's a different kind of tension. In my D&D games, my players pick up a plethora of quests. Competing factions have contradictory goals, and the players have to contend with a difficult political landscape. When we're not dungeon crawling, my players spend their time worried about strategy. Is this the right thing to do, or are our priorities straight? Should we start with Utopia or with Gaxic Point? But once we're in the arena, there's this wave of relief. It doesn't matter if this is the optimal thing they should be doing. That's beside the point. They are in the arena now. They're not turning back. The best thing they can do is survive with their resources minimally affected, because once they're in the arena, they're no longer worried about strategy. They're worried about tactics. We trade out the strategic tension of what should we be doing, and now it's the tactical tension of what is the best way to do this. That changing of gears is essential to renewing your players' interest in the game. By frequently changing between strategy and tactics, you engage different parts of your players' psyche. Each time you swap from politics to the arena, they're able to re-engage with the adventure on renewed terms with reinvigorated excitement. And nothing does that better than dungeons. Partly because of the other pillars we'll talk about later in the video, but also because of the cultural memory of dungeons. Once you describe a dungeon to your players, if they're at all familiar with the hobby, they'll understand the assignment. Get into the dungeon, kill stuff, loot stuff. At that point, the game kind of runs itself. You, just like your players, will experience that sort of phase shift from strategic to tactical thinking as you're able to relax and just run rooms and dungeon crawls. And it can be super fun too. A good dungeon crawl is a whole arena where danger is around every corner, where every lost hit point will haunt you, or as the second pillar is called, danger. Dungeons are the personification of the resource economy. Since 5e has mechanics that recharge every day, that means one of the primary parts of that system has to do with resource management. Characters must conserve spell slots, once per day abilities, and etc. They must use them tactically to maximize their effectiveness. A dungeon is the ideal arena of the resource economy. A spell slot spent in Area 2 isn't available in Area 3. This means that if you stick your party in a dungeon, and you make it very difficult to rest in the dungeon, you're designing adventures to the system's strength. Suddenly, every goblin in every room is draining your party's total resources, and every encounter is collectively increasing the difficulty of the dungeon. But it's more than just that. Dungeons & Dragons is designed around the idea that you're delving into dungeons and doing multiple encounters in a day. D&D is at its strongest when you're running dungeons. I didn't say that D&D is the best system for dungeon crawls. I said D&D is best when it's running dungeon crawls. There's a difference. Dungeons come with danger baked in. Every encounter builds on resources lost before. Every monster highlights the theme of the dungeon. Every funky room points at the theme of the dungeon. Thinking of dungeons like this turns them from a series of singular encounters into a gauntlet. It's a three-dimensional challenge to overcome. The question is no longer will the players survive the encounter, but will the players win the dungeon? Your string of encounters, rooms, and resource management creates a puzzle the players have to solve. Every decision they make feeds into that puzzle, like playing 12 games of chess at once, or sequentially. Everything becomes tactical. Do I use the knock spell to open this door? That's a second level spell slot I won't have later. But if the rogue tries to open the door with sleight of hand, well, that might take time, which might mean a wandering monster. Which is more important, our time or my spell slot? Or your fighter might wonder, do I action surge to kill this ogre before he can pummel the party's squishy wizard next turn? Which is the more important resource, my action surge or the wizard's hit points? These questions elevate your game from hack and slash into a long-term tactical decision-making game. It adds an element of chess to your game. Your tactical players will be rewarded for their system mastery, not in character creation, which I frankly find dull, but in play, a moment-to-moment decision-making scrum. That's gameplay, the informed choices being made. That question of which is more important, A or B, is the game you're playing. It's the challenge you're presenting. Without it, combat is just a pit stop from the story. With it, you elevate the story. When everything goes well, the players will feel like they've earned it. Like all those decisions they made were the right decisions. And when everything goes poorly, the players will often see it coming. They'll know they made a bad decision and they'll see the mounting challenges that come with it. And they'll have plenty of opportunity to fix their mistakes by elevating their tactical thinking. They might fail to fix it, but by noticing it, the consequences aren't coming out of the blue. They'll feel like the cost of failure made sense and it was a natural result of their decisions. Let's imagine a scenario. The party enters the dungeon with a combat objective, to stop a ritual, but there are loads of monsters between them and the ritual chamber in the boss room. If they waste a bunch of time in the dungeon, resting, being slow, being methodical, there will be a consequence. Maybe you've repeatedly communicated that the ritual is making progress. The party hears the chanting and the completion of each verse. The walls bleed, and the screaming mass is closer to being summoned. By the time they get to the ritual chamber, it's a full 23 hours after they entered the dungeon, and the screaming mass has already been summoned. It's gone. And the players think to themselves, maybe we shouldn't have ignored those bleeding walls. Time is a resource they have to manage, along with everything else. Essentially what I'm telling you is that a dungeon has two kinds of meta currencies, the player's resources and the plot timer. Players who kick down every door and bum rush every encounter will get to the final boss room with plenty of time to spare, but with no resources to fight the boss, because they spent them all on the blitzkrieg. But like I said earlier, players who meander around have all the resources in the world to fight the boss, but they get there too late and the boss is gone. So the players have to play the game of which resource is more important at every step, time or their character abilities. That's the game you're presenting them with. That's what a dungeon is about. Resting. Inevitably, when I'm talking about taxing the player's resources, about the resource economy, I get asked about what happens when the players decide to take a long rest and get all their resources back. That will ruin the tension of your dungeon. I don't think players should be allowed to rest freely in a dungeon. Because, and this applies to more than just dungeons, players have two conflicting motives in their head. Number one, they want to tell a story with their friends and have a narrative arc. Number two, they want to win in the easiest way possible. But winning by the easiest way possible isn't a narrative arc. A narrative arc has tension. Or more specifically, it has intention and obstacle. Brief sidebar. Let me tell you a story. The cult of the Screaming Mass wants to end the world. Octavia the Paladin heard about them and then she stopped them. Technically that's a story, I guess, but it's shit. That's because there is no obstacle blocking her from achieving her intention. Without obstacles, you're not really telling a story as much as you're sharing an anecdote. So how's this? The cult of the Screaming Mass wants to end the world. Octavia the Paladin heard about it, and she wants to stop them. But she couldn't find them. So she had to gather allies who might know and assemble a party. Only the party wasn't working together at all, so she had to forge long-lasting relationships with them. But one of them is previously a member of the Screaming Mass cult, and Octavia wonders if she can trust them. Each scenario I just described adds a new intention for Octavia, and new obstacles, which invite new intentions. That question of what happens next and can Octavia achieve her goals? That question, that's the story. Anyways, resting. If the party can rest after every fight, and there is no reason not to, then they will rest after every fight. And as a result, they will never be in danger. And without danger, there is no obstacle blocking their intention. So there is no tension in the story. Your players just end up playing an anecdote. We went into the dungeon and we won. That doesn't sound fun. Given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of a game. So don't give them the opportunity. One of the DM's many jobs is to make those two conflicting desires be the same desire. And it's usually not that hard. The world has to stop them from optimizing the fun out of the game. Make resting in the dungeon impossible, or at the very least, incredibly impractical. When they try to rest, they should get attacked by a wandering monster, because rolling initiative interrupts any rest. Or if you think there should be a chance to rest in a dungeon, you, the DM, need to create cost-benefit analysis by using the two meta currencies I talked about before. Say the heroes can rest in a dungeon, but it takes time, and the bad guys will continue summoning the ritual while the heroes take a little nap. With that in mind, you can set a time limit to create a set difficulty for the dungeon. Before the players go into the dungeon, you can tell them, through an NPC or whatever, the ritual completes in 11 hours. That way they'll know that they've got the budget for one long rest, and about 2 short rests, providing they can crawl through the whole dungeon in under an hour. Or you could figure that a dungeon is only safe to rest in under certain circumstances. Say they clear a floor, or find a door they can lock down, or a hiding spot they could use. You might then build those safeguards in, or when your players find one you hadn't intended, you can decide to let them use it. As a DM, you have endless tools at your disposal to set the difficulty, so don't underestimate the value of the ticking clock. And definitely don't underestimate the value of wandering monsters in a dungeon. It can make the whole crawl come alive. Make the whole crawl what? Vibes. You could be doing all of this in a dank, underground stone structure. That's a dungeon. But the pink, overgrown tower of the princess in the Feywild is also a dungeon. So is the haunted mansion where the shrieking banshee lives. A dungeon is vibes, and you can make the vibes exquisite. You might hear me say dungeon and think of a tomb, or catacombs, or underground labyrinths, sewers, etc. And while those are all iconic dungeons, they're not the only thing a dungeon can be. A dungeon isn't necessarily a dungeon. It's just a structure to contain your story setting. When we say dungeons, we mean locations where adventures take place. And when we say rooms, we mean areas within that location that feature self-contained content. Dungeons, I think, are the best way to render your story setting in minutia. If you want to set an adventure in the Feywild, for instance, I still think you need a dungeon. A rotten windmill covered in autumn leaves. Inside, children's toys, jars full of severed fingers, and a large cauldron. There's a yard outside, bottom floor, a second story, an attic, and a basement. That's 5 rooms. The yard is occupied by hostile twig blights who want to eat intruders. The bottom floor has a cauldron and the ingredients, a puzzle that asks the players what is being brewed. The second story has a hostage, an old priest that was taken by the resident, who we'll learn is a hag, the setback. The attic contains a strange, eclectic collection of single-use magic items, a resolution, and the basement is where the hag is currently gorging herself on the dreams of pixies, a climax. That's a 5-room dungeon that would have never felt like a dungeon with a capital D. It's just an adventure location. But you could easily place characters in there. They'll ponder the cauldron, debate if they go into the basement or up towards the next story. They'll pick up jars full of fingers and wonder what they mean. They'll talk to an old priest and collect magic items. They'll play the game. And every one of those things you'll render with a feeling of the Feywild. The jars of fingers can be both whimsical and gross. Pixie fingers next to giant fingers. The cauldron bubbles with blue liquid and dead pixies inside. The old man speaks only in rhyme. The single-use magic items are all hag's brews. By creating a dungeon, we end up playing on a tiny scale. It forces us DMs to go into micro details. And now we've immersed our players in the setting. The Feywild informs our choices as we make up the stuff they interact with. Dungeons are unmatched when it comes to rendering in microscopic detail. You can't help yourself. Every detail feels important, and by extension, every detail informs the story, setting, lore, and campaign. I couldn't tell you the amount of times my dungeon's improvised set dressing ended up being plot significant, just through my players' sheer willpower. Your first few dungeons might not land all the stuff we're talking about. I mean, 6 pillars is a lot to manage. But if you start simple and slowly build outwards, your experience will grow over time. I'm a big believer in repetition and gaining expertise through experience, quality through quantity. When you repeat exercises over and over, you build up an innate understanding of your subject matter that makes it easier and easier to approach. It's the best way to learn, which is why this video is sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant makes learning math, science, and computer science fun and interactive. Instead of passively watching videos, you work through hands-on puzzles and logical challenges that sharpen your skills through repetition every day. They, like me, place great stock in learning a little every day, both on the go and at home, on their app and in hands-on lessons. To try everything Brilliant has to offer for free for a full 30 days, visit brilliant.org/mysticarts or scan the QR code on screen. Or you can click the link in the description. You'll also get 20% off of an annual premium subscription. Constraints. It's easy to forget, but one of the most useful things dungeons do is constrain the scope of the narrative. Unlike the vague space, they're not infinite white rooms that go on nebulously in every direction. They have walls, doors, floors, and ceilings. Dungeons make it easier to answer questions about where everything is, what the players can interact with, and the big one, where players can go next. You know that moment when you're running an overworld adventure and your players suddenly go in a direction you hadn't thought of, and now you're desperately trying to figure out what a session in Buck Tussle is going to feel like, with no preconceived notions about it? That can't happen in a dungeon. You sort of know what all the options are. The players are in Area 12, and nearby doors lead to Areas 13 and 15. One of those has a monster in it, a specter, so you get the specter ready as the players explore Area 12, just to be prepared. It's kind of relaxing. I find myself so calm and confident the moment the dungeon crawl starts. I'm not even slightly anxious about what could happen next. I mean, it's still an open game, an RPG where anything can happen, but the scope of that anything is so much smaller when constrained by walls, doors, floors, and ceilings. If you're normally anxious when running the game and you haven't tried dungeons, give it a go and see if it doesn't relax you. It worked like a charm on me. I mean, that's not to say you should only run dungeon crawls. My games aren't all dungeons all the time, quite far from it. But when I do run them, it's like being on break. I'm basically just playing the game like a player, but I control the monsters. Which, mind you, is probably why many old school players were also dungeon masters, unlike how it is today. It's a lot easier to run session after session of dungeon crawling than it is to run session after session of politics or espionage or other roleplay heavy scenarios, because constraints in direction also lead to constraints in choices. There's this fantastic video from Questing Beast called The Tunic Principle that talks about the time until next impactful choice, where Ben argues that what makes RPGs special is the fact that they're an open game, as opposed to a closed one. That is to say, anything is possible. Players can try anything, which means RPGs are about that openness. What makes a good game session is how short the tunic is, how quickly we get from one impactful choice to the next. I really don't have much to add to his take. He's entirely correct. Go check out that video if you haven't seen it. And here's the rub. A dungeon condenses that tunic because you can put impactful choices everywhere. Like we talked about earlier, resources and time, they're impactful choices, but you can do so much more than that. You could find a creature that isn't overtly hostile and try and convince it to join you for the rest of your crawl. You could find a third faction and fight them, or maybe strike a bargain with them. You could find a morally dubious magic item and ponder whether to attune to it for the combat edge you'll get, even if you lose a bit of yourself. You could choose to go down an entirely optional side route, chasing after a rumor, a magic item, or a treasure vault, because that might be helpful. An enemy mook could surrender, and now you have to decide between letting it go, possibly alerting the rest of the dungeon, or murdering a prisoner of war. Dungeons constrain the scope, highlight the gameplay, and condense the choices. And now you're in the trenches of fantasy warfare, making impactful decisions around every corner. Playing a long game of will we win the dungeon, and am I willing to put myself, my allies, or my mortality at risk in return for an edge? It's exhilarating. 6 pillars, and that could be it. But there's something on the altar at the end of the room. The altar says tradition. Appropriate, isn't it? All those 6 pillars were leading up to this. This dungeon we've been exploring is a temple. Dungeons are kind of about tradition, about the history of the game. They have this cultural link back into the hobby's collective memory, and they feel important because of it. A regular dungeon crawl is elevated a little unfairly because it feels appropriate to crawl through a dungeon when playing Dungeons and Dragons. It's the name of the game. I remember when I played Tomb of Horrors, an experience I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemy. I was enthralled and infatuated with the history of it. The thought of the thousands of nerds who had crawled through it, died in it, or won it. I remember the first time I died in a dungeon crawl, and I bet you'll remember the first time you entered a dungeon corridor and you were terrified and excited at the same time. It's kind of weird, but I have this nostalgia for a time I never lived in, like a yearning for the simple days of when dungeons were the game. It's fascinating to me. But maybe you heard all that and you thought, I disagree, and that's fine. We shouldn't worship at the altar of tradition for tradition's sake. That can be a very unhealthy way to live your life. And I often find that yearning a little gross, but when I use it as a weapon, it hooks my players. I am not above abusing any trick in my toolbox to hook my players. I'll use the cultural memory of dungeons to engage my players into the feeling they're taking part in something historically accurate about the game. I'll use my knowledge of a player's actual personal characteristics to hook their player characters. I'll use my understanding of a player's ambitions to get them excited about playing the game. And I'll use my knowledge of their personal beliefs to embolden their quest against the villain who espouses the opposite beliefs. Tradition is a weapon in your toolbox you can use to hook your players into the feeling that they're somehow doing something important on a grand scale. The dungeon. Let's take a step back and look at what we're talking about here. This whole dungeon crawl thing is an essential pillar of the hobby. It may have fallen out of favor in newer editions, and it may not feature all that much on the most popular actual plays, but despite all that, it is still the main engine of the game. If you've ever run, or even just read, a published module or adventure, you'll know for a fact that almost all of them end in a dungeon crawl. Lost Mine of Phandelver ends in Wave Echo Cave, Rime of the Frost Maiden ends in Ithrin, and even Waterdeep Dragon Heist manages to end in 2 dungeon crawls back to back, with the second dungeon being dependent on the season the adventure takes place in. Haven't I said this before? And it's not just whole campaigns that end in dungeons, but also every adventure within a campaign ends in a dungeon. Let's take this adventure as an example. Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus. It's one of my favorite adventures, despite its many shortcomings. It brilliantly mixes genres of exploration. Granted, Descent into Avernus' final chapter isn't a dungeon crawl, but a series of events with forking choices.
Somebody royally forked up.
However, the penultimate chapter is a dungeon crawl. But this campaign, like any other campaign, is a series of adventures, all strung together into an overarching campaign. And each of those adventures ends in a dungeon crawl. Just look at this flowchart from chapter 1. Dialogue scene, exploration scene, dungeon crawl, followed by social encounter, combat scene, and then a dungeon crawl. After that, we transition into the end of chapter 1's series of floating scenes that take you eventually into El Terrell, a point crawl that ends with a dungeon crawl, which takes you into Avernus. And look, dungeon dialogue, dungeon dialogue, dungeon dialogue, dungeon dialogue. So why do official modules do this? On one hand, it's easier to write, lay out, and sell a dungeon than it is to do with other kinds of adventures, but it's also easier to run, and it's fun to play. The game is stripped down to its essentials and presented to you in a simplistic light. I think it's kind of healthy for players and DMs and the longevity of your game and the hobby. You might then think it's perfect that Descent into Avernus has so many dungeon crawls in it, but actually I didn't run that many of them. I thought there were too many dungeon crawls, and not enough of the other modes of exploration. I would string in some of the other 5 types of exploration, in particular point crawls and highlighted rooms and vague spaces, and then all kinds of social situations to elevate the adventure, at least at my table. Dungeons can be boring, especially if there's a lot of them, or if they go on for a really long time. All of that can lead them to getting more and more dull. So you mix it up with other types of exploration. But also, you could mix up the interior of the dungeon. Don't just make an endless collection of stone corridors. Try to make each level unique, each room exciting. You, the creator of the dungeon, should be excited to make each room. You should be giddy about the stuff you're putting in there. You should be rekindling your excitement every time you sit down to run, because your excitement will be your players' excitement. Whatever you bring, they'll match. When I was preparing a mega dungeon on a recent live stream, someone in chat asked if I hadn't put in too many wildly different things into the dungeon. I tried my best to explain that a mega dungeon is a bit like a TV show. Certain elements belong to the season arc, while other elements belong to the individual episode. And in each session, one of them is the B-plot and the other one is the A-plot. The dungeon's factions and environmental storytelling tie the rooms together as the serialization of the TV show. But the job of each individual area was to feel episodic and new and fresh week to week. That way, there is always both familiarity and novelty. If you're going to be running long dungeons for multiple sessions, back to back to back, you need to bake in novelty and familiarity. I find thinking of it as both episodic and serialized storytelling helps a lot. You know the format, you've watched TV. The show starts and we hook into the episode's monster of the week, that area's specific monster theme. Then we spend some time on serialization, how the monster of the week feeds into the episode itself, into the grander story. We talk about where the characters are planning to go next, what their goals are. Then we delve into the episodic arc, fighting or negotiating with the monster of the week, which is only there because of whatever's going on in the main storyline. And then we wrap up by hooking back into the main storyline, and next week we rinse and repeat. For special milestones in the dungeon, you mix and match. So the A-plot and the B-plot swap. The serialization is up front and center, and the episodic plot stays in the back. And you can do all of that without sacrificing any of the choices or gameplay too. Whatever your A-plot is, that's the game. Your B-plot isn't the game, it's just foreshadowing, it's set dressing. You just insert little hints and leave it at that. And then you run the A-plot, the main show. Running dungeons like this will get them to feel like the story and not just an obstacle in the adventure. Your game can be both dungeons and stories. You don't have to pick. It's a false dichotomy. Dungeons aren't a system to replace the story you're telling. They're a tool to help you constrain the scope of the narrative into a shape you can cope with. And since they can be any shape, not just an underground complex, the constraints aren't arbitrary. You design the shape. Use them as a tool to heighten the tension, highlight the macro details, and put your characters in danger. Trust me, your players will love it. And that's where we'll pick it up next time. Thanks so much for watching this video. This channel is run by me and my girlfriend. And if you want to support us directly, consider joining our Patreon, where this month, Adept tier patrons get dungeons. Plural. Last week, it was All Hail Gek. This week, it's the Wreck of the Wavesplitter, a dungeon we designed together on stream, and my collaborator Magnus has since edited. It's got a mushroom god, a cannon golem, and an eye patch that's also a portable hole. You're gonna love it. And if you're feeling especially generous, you might like the video, comment, share, or subscribe and hit the bell to be notified when we release new videos. Until next time, keep studying the mystic arts.